The city's glass towers loomed like giants against a darkened sky, their reflections shimmering in rain-soaked streets. William Moore, draped in a perfectly tailored suit, stood beneath the awning of his office building. The rain pelted down in steady rhythms, a cold reminder of the solitude that defined his nights. With a flick of his wrist, he signaled for his driver, eager to escape the oppressive silence that awaited him in his penthouse. But then he saw her. A woman stood near the service entrance, her frame bent slightly as she sorted through a dumpster. Despite her weathered clothes and silver-streaked hair, she moved with a quiet dignity that didn't match the scene. Her trembling hands carefully pulled out a discarded takeout box. She inspected it, her movements deliberate, before setting it aside as though it were a treasure. Something about her stilled him. He told himself to look away. It wasn't his concern, but his feet remained rooted. A fragment of memory stirred deep within him, a soft hum of a lullaby, the warmth of cookies baking in a small kitchen. It was nonsense, he thought, brushing it aside. "Sir, should I bring the car around?" His driver's voice cut through the rain, snapping him back to reality. As William turned, his wallet slipped from his coat pocket, landing silently in a shallow puddle. The woman noticed immediately. She hesitated, her tired eyes scanning the man who now walked away. Finally, she called out, her voice thin but clear, "Sir." William didn't hear her. Rain muffled her words, but she bent down, retrieving the wallet from the water. Its expensive leather felt foreign in her hands. She opened her mouth to call out again but hesitated. There was enough cash inside to buy her weeks of food, a warm coat, maybe even shelter for the night. Her fingers trembled, not from cold but from choice. "Sir, please wait." Her voice cut through the rain, louder this time. William turned, his eyes narrowing as she hurried toward him. She stopped a few feet away, holding the wallet out with both hands. Rain dripped from her sleeve. "You dropped this," she said simply. William stared at her, then the wallet. He hadn't even noticed it was missing. For the first time in years, something cracked in the walls he had built around himself. "Why didn't you keep it?" he asked softly. Her answer was steady and sure, "Because that wouldn't be right." And in that moment, something shifted. The penthouse elevator opened directly into William Moore's private sanctuary, a vast expanse of marble floors and glass walls overlooking the city's glittering skyline. The room was immaculate, too immaculate, as though untouched by human hands. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was stifling. Ruth hesitated on the threshold, her fingers tightening around the frayed edges of her thin jacket. She had never seen anything like this before. A wall of windows framed the city like a living painting, and sleek furniture sat like sculptures in an art exhibit. Yet despite its grandeur, the space felt empty. "You really don't have to do this," she said softly, her voice barely breaking the stillness. William turned, already shrugging out of his wet coat. "It's late, and the shelters are probably full. One night won't hurt," he replied, his tone curt but not unkind. He gestured toward the massive leather couch. "Make yourself comfortable." Ruth stepped cautiously inside, each step tentative as though she feared she might leave a mark on the pristine floor. Her eyes swept over the room, catching on a small framed photograph tucked onto a side table. It showed a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9, dressed in a crisp school uniform. His shy smile was unmistakable. William followed her gaze and stiffened. "That's me," he said, his voice tight. "A long time ago. You were a beautiful child." Ruth murmured, her voice tinged with something William couldn't quite place. He frowned, brushing past her comment. "You'll find the guest room down the hall," he said briskly, leading her away from the living room. "It has its own bathroom and everything you'll need." As they walked through the cavernous space, Ruth's gaze lingered on the little details. The untouched bookshelves, the overly polished surfaces, the absence of anything personal beyond that single photograph. The luxury was undeniable, but there was no warmth here. The shelter would have been fine, Ruth said, pausing at the doorway of the guest room. It's pouring out, William replied, his tone softening. You'd be soaked by now. This is better. For a moment the two stood in silence. Ruth watched him, sensing the tension in his shoulders, the heaviness in his gaze. There was a loneliness in this man, buried beneath his polished exterior, and it tugged at her. Thank you, she said finally, her voice warm despite her exhaustion. William nodded curtly. Good night. As he turned and walked away, the emptiness of the penthouse seemed to magnify. Ruth lingered in the doorway, her fingers brushing against the locket at her neck. She glanced back at the photo of the boy with the shy smile, her heart aching with unspoken memories. Good night, she whispered into the silence, though she knew he wouldn't hear. The smell of fresh coffee and warm toast filled the penthouse the next morning, a stark contrast to its usual sterile atmosphere. Ruth moved around the sleek modern kitchen with quiet efficiency, her hand steady despite the unfamiliar surroundings. The borrowed clothes William had left for her hung loosely on her frame, but they were clean and dry. When William entered, his tie half loosened and his phone in hand, he stopped abruptly. The sight of Ruth carefully arranging breakfast on the counter caught him off guard. You didn't have to do this, he said, setting his phone aside. Ruth glanced up and smiled softly. It's the least I can do. You were kind enough to let me stay. She gestured to the table. Please, sit. Reluctantly, William complied, lowering himself into one of the high-backed chairs. The table was modestly set, a plate of toast, sliced fruit, and a pot of steaming coffee. Despite its simplicity, it felt oddly comforting. As they ate, Ruth's gentle presence began to ease the usual tension that filled William's mornings. The conversation started slowly, with polite questions about how she had slept, but soon it delved deeper. I was a teacher, Ruth said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. English literature, for 15 years. William looked up, surprised. A teacher? She nodded, her smile faint but genuine. I loved watching my students discover themselves in stories, finding courage in heroes, hope in endings they didn't expect. She paused, her gaze growing distant. But life doesn't always go as planned. Sometimes the choices we make for love come at a cost. William stirred his coffee, the clinking of the spoon against the cup the only sound for a moment. Her words struck a chord he wasn't ready to confront. What happened? He asked softly. Ruth hesitated, her hand instinctively reaching for the silver locket around her neck. She held it tightly, as though drawing strength from its weight. I lost someone dear to me, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. William noticed the way her fingers caressed the locket, its surface worn from years of handling. That locket, he said, leaning slightly forward. It must mean a lot to you. It does, Ruth admitted, her eyes dropping to the table. It's all I have left of them. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, and for the first time in years, William found himself wanting to ask more, to understand more. But before he could, his phone buzzed with an urgent message from his office. Ruth saw the hesitation in his expression and smiled gently. Go. Work calls. William stood, pocketing his phone, but he lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Thank you for breakfast. It's my pleasure, Ruth replied, watching as he left. When the door closed behind him, Ruth sighed and looked down at the locket in her hand. She opened it, revealing a faded photograph inside, the young woman cradling a baby in her arms. Her thumb brushed over the image as a single tear fell, her whisper barely audible. My son. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the Charity Center's dusty halls, casting long shadows across its worn floors. William walked through the neglected building with Ruth by his side, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. The center had once been a beacon of hope in the community, his father's proudest achievement, but years of neglect had reduced it to a shell of its former self. Ruth's eyes scanned the walls, where faded posters and empty shelves told stories of better days. Her steps faltered when they reached a corner of the main hallway. On a small side table, beneath a cracked layer of glass, sat a photograph of a group of children and volunteers. William barely noticed her reaction as he spoke. "This place used to be full of life. My father poured everything into it, but he never brought me here. I only saw it in pictures." His tone was neutral, but Ruth could hear the bitterness beneath it. As he moved on, Ruth lingered behind, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the edge of the frame. Among the smiling faces in the photograph, she saw herself, a much younger version. Her hair pulled back, her arms wrapped protectively around a small boy. Her heart raced as memories surfaced. The laughter of children, the warmth of shared meals, and the boy's tiny hand gripping her so tightly. Her breath hitched, and she pulled her hand back as if burned. "Ruth?" William's voice startled her. She turned quickly, forcing a smile. "I'm sorry, I was just admiring this old photo. It must have been a wonderful place back then." William studied her, sensing something he couldn't quite place. "It was," he said after a pause. "At least that's what I've been told. My father never thought it was important to share this part of his life with me." Ruth nodded, her smile fading. "Sometimes, people have a hard time showing their love in ways that matter." William frowned, but before he could respond, a young volunteer approached them, interrupting the moment. "Mr. Moore, we've prepared the list of repairs for your review." William nodded and turned to follow the volunteer, his mind already shifting back to business. Ruth watched him go, her chest tight with the weight of unspoken words. She looked back at the photograph one last time before hurrying to catch up. In the quiet of the nearly abandoned center, the echoes of a mother's love reverberated in the silence, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The evening air in the penthouse felt heavier than usual, thick with unspoken tension. Ruth sat at the dining table, staring at her hands as she twisted the thin chain of her locket. Across from her, William's brow was furrowed, his laptop forgotten as he flipped through the file his private investigator had delivered earlier that day. The silence stretched until William finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Ruth, there's something I need to ask you." Ruth's heart skipped, her fingers tightening around the locket. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "What is it?" William leaned back in his chair, holding up a worn document, a birth record. "This was in the file. It lists a boy born 40 years ago at St. Mary's Hospital. Mother's name, Ruth Collins. Father, James Moore." Ruth's breath caught, her face paling. The walls she had carefully built to protect herself and William began to crumble. "I had Porter dig deeper," William continued, his voice taut with restrained emotion. "The timeline matches, Ruth. The charity center, the hospital, even the stories you've told me." He leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "You're my mother, aren't you?" Tears filled Ruth's eyes, spilling over as she clutched the locket to her chest. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Yes." William stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He paced to the window, his fists clenching and unclenching. "You've been here this whole time," he said, his voice thick with anger and disbelief. "You let me pour my heart out to you about my childhood, about growing up without a mother, and you said nothing." "I was afraid," Ruth said, rising to her feet. "Afraid of losing you again. Afraid you'd hate me for what I did." William turned to face her, his jaw tight. "You left me," he said, his voice breaking. "You abandoned me. How could you do that?" Ruth's sobs grew heavier, but she didn't look away. "Your grandfather gave me no choice," she said. "He said if I stayed, he'd make sure you grew up with nothing. He threatened to destroy your future, William. I thought leaving was the only way to protect you." "You thought abandoning me was protecting me?" William's voice rose, the pain in his chest spilling out. Ruth stepped closer, desperate to make him understand. "I never stopped loving you," she cried. "Every day, every night. I searched for you. I worked in shelters, stayed in the city, praying that one day I'd find you again. But your grandfather, he made sure I couldn't. He changed your name, took you away from me." William's hands trembled as he pressed them against his temples, his breathing unsteady. "All those years," he said quietly, "I grew up thinking you didn't care, that you didn't want me." "I wanted you more than anything," Ruth said, her voice breaking. "I kept this locket as a reminder of you, of the love I carried for you. I never stopped believing we'd find each other again." William looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, pain, and something else, something softer that he wasn't ready to name. "You should have told me sooner," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Ruth replied, her tears falling freely, "and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. But please, William, don't shut me out now. Let me make it right." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the city below. Finally, William turned back to the window, staring out into the night. "I need time," he said, his voice hollow. Ruth nodded, though her heart ached at the distance between them. "I'll wait," she whispered, "as long as it takes." And as William stood in silence, the weight of their shared pain hung between them, a bridge that neither was quite ready to cross. The morning sun bathed the charity center in a golden glow as workers moved purposefully, hauling equipment and laying the final touches on the renovations. The once crumbling building had been transformed into a vibrant space, brimming with new hope. William stood at the entrance, watching the activity with a quiet intensity. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his thoughts a swirling storm. Ruth stood beside him, her presence gentle yet steady. The air between them had been heavy since their confrontation, but neither had spoken of it again. William glanced at her, noting the way her eyes softened as she watched the center come to life. "You care about this place," he said, breaking the silence. Ruth nodded, her fingers brushing against the locket she still wore. "It's where I felt closest to you, even when you weren't there. It was my way of holding on." William looked away, his jaw tightening. He didn't respond, but her words lingered. Inside, the newly renovated classrooms were bustling with children painting colorful murals on the walls. Clara Johnson, a single mother, William had met during his visits, greeted them with a bright smile. "Mr. Moore, Mrs. Collins," she said warmly, "you have to see what the kids have been working on." Ruth's face lit up as Clara led them into a room where a mural stretched across one wall. It depicted a tree with vibrant leaves, its roots sprawling outward and intertwining with scenes of families, books, and homes. At the center of the tree was a golden heart. "It's a symbol of what this place means to us," Clara explained. "A second chance, a place to grow." Ruth touched the painting lightly, her throat tightening with emotion. "It's beautiful," she whispered. William studied the mural, his eyes lingering on the heart. Something about it stirred a deep ache inside him, a reminder of the locket, of the connection he couldn't yet fully accept. Clara turned to him, her expression earnest. "You've done more than rebuild a building, Mr. Moore. You've rebuilt hope for families like mine. Thank you." Her words struck him like a blow. For years, he'd measured success in profits and accolades. But standing here, surrounded by tangible change, he felt something deeper. Purpose. As they walked through the center, Ruth stopped in front of a small library filled with shelves of books. Her eyes softened as she ran her fingers along the spines. "When I was a teacher, I used to dream of places like this," she said. William watched her, his heart heavy. He had been angry, furious even, but seeing her here, so fully invested in this place, he couldn't deny the truth. She had never stopped caring. "Why didn't you give up?" he asked suddenly. Ruth turned to him, surprised by the question. "Because you were my son," she said simply. "And no matter how far you were, no matter how much time passed, I never stopped loving you." Her words pierced through his defenses, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to really look at her. Not as the woman who had lied, but as the mother who had endured unimaginable pain to protect him. "I don't know if I can forgive everything," William admitted, his voice quiet. Ruth's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she nodded. "I don't expect you to, William, but I'll keep showing up as long as you'll let me." For a moment, they stood in silence, the sound of children's laughter echoing around them. Slowly, William extended his hand toward her, a small but significant gesture. Ruth hesitated, her breath catching, before taking it. And in that moment, the first bricks of the bridge between them began to be laid. Not by words, but by the quiet, undeniable pull of a mother's love and a son's tentative steps toward healing. The grand reopening of the Moore Foundation Community Center was a celebration unlike any other. Families gathered in the courtyard, their laughter and conversations filling the air with warmth and life. Bright banners fluttered in the breeze, and volunteers in blue shirts moved through the crowd, guiding tours and handing out refreshments. William Moore stood at the podium, his tailored suit immaculate, but there was a noticeable softness to his demeanor. His usual commanding presence was tempered by something new: humility. Beside him stood Ruth, her simple navy dress a stark contrast to the opulence of the event, yet she held herself with quiet grace. "Thank you all for being here today," William began, his voice steady yet heartfelt. "This center isn't just a building, it's a promise, a commitment to this community and to the belief that everyone deserves a second chance." The crowd erupted in applause, but William raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "But before we cut the ribbon, there's someone I need to thank. Someone who taught me the true meaning of resilience, love, and what it means to truly see people for who they are." He turned to Ruth, his voice softening as he gestured for her to join him at the microphone. Ruth hesitated, her hands trembling slightly, but William extended his hand. She took it, and he helped her step forward. The crowd quieted, sensing the significance of the moment. "This is Ruth Collins," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's not just my mother, she's the reason I stand here today. Her courage and love, even in the face of unimaginable hardship, have inspired everything we're doing here." Ruth's eyes shimmered with tears as she gripped the microphone, her voice unsteady but clear. "Thank you," she began, looking out at the crowd. "This place, it's more than bricks and mortar. It's a place where people can rebuild their lives, where hope can take root, even in the darkest of times." She glanced at William, her voice softening, "And it's also the place where I found my son again." The crowd gasped softly, the emotional weight of her words hanging in the air. "For years I carried this locket," Ruth said, holding it up for all to see. "It was my only connection to him. I thought I had lost him forever. But life has a way of surprising us." William reached into his pocket and pulled out the matching locket, holding it in his palm. The gesture was quiet, but its significance was monumental. The applause that followed was thunderous. Families cheered, volunteers wiped their eyes, and even the most hardened reporters dabbed at their cheeks with tissues. As Ruth stepped down from the stage, Clara Johnson approached her with her children in tow. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "Because of you and Mr. Moore, my kids have a future again." Ruth smiled, bending down to hug Clara's youngest. "Never stop believing in second chances," she said softly. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the event wound down, William and Ruth stood side by side, watching the sunset over the city skyline. The golden light bathed the newly renovated center, its gleaming windows reflecting the vibrant life within. "This place feels alive again," Ruth said, her voice filled with quiet pride. William nodded. "It does, and so do I." He turned to her, his expression unguarded for the first time in years. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you, Mom, to really see you." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "You see me now," she said, her voice steady. That's all that matters. As the last of the light faded and the city lights began to twinkle, they stood together, mother and son. Not just as people who had been reunited, but as a family, finally whole, finally home. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.